From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump announces he's running for president again in 2024 as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis fires back at some of the criticism from Mr. Trump. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. As expected on Tuesday night at Mar-a-Lago, President Trump announced, well, listen to this.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
Kim, it was about an hour-long speech. It struck me as classic stream of Trump consciousness, somewhat restrained in terms of the attacks that he was making, some of his usual hyperbole. Under me, we had the greatest economy in the history of the galaxy, that sort of thing. Kim, what did you make of his speech?
Yes, I'd push back a little bit in that what struck me about the speech was how it wasn't a Trump stream of consciousness. Yes, it had all the Trump hallmarks, that we were living in the most glorious time ever, a lot of superlatives, a lot of adjectives. But the speechwriter, in my mind, actually put together a speech that if Trump was serious about trying to remake a connection with the country, this would be more like what he would do. It didn't look back at 2020 and dwell on stolen elections. It reminded people of what he had actually accomplished while he was in office. It talked about how we needed to get back to that point, criticism of the Biden administration and where we had landed, where we are now in terms of inflation. But, not some of the bitterness that is associated with Trump, and it much more tightly written. And he largely, not entirely, but largely stayed on script. Now, the problem is that a lot of people have seen this before, right? There have been moments where Donald Trump actually managed to keep on the teleprompter. He seemed to sound more presidential. But everyone knows that's not really who he is. And I think everybody is aware that now that he's out there and the candidacy is launched, it's going to be gloves off, and we're going to be back to slapping around our competitors and coming up with names for them and, really punching and making jibes and the big mega rallies. So that was kind of what stuck out to me listening to it.
Those are good points, I think, about, first of all, the lack of discussion of the 2020 election and Trump's stolen election theories, which he has not changed his mind about or repudiated. He just wasn't talking about it last night. And also the more upbeat tone. It was a less aggrieved Trump than we have seen sometimes in the past. I guess what I meant by stream of consciousness is, he was clearly reading a speech from a teleprompter, and it is hard sometimes to figure out when he's on the prompter and when he's not on the prompter. But I was just jotting a few notes down. Things like, inflation, the best number is not 0, it's 1. Did you know that? The economist said it should be 2, and I said, let's make it 1. And it's kind of fun to try to guess when he's ad-libbing there. There was also this bit about how we're going to be asking everyone who's caught selling drugs to receive the death penalty. And then he was discussing how he was speaking with China's President Xi, and they don't have a drug problem in China because if you're caught selling the drugs, by the end of the day, you have been summarily tried and executed. A couple other points that jumped out at me just in terms of kind of policy promises, pitches on the campaign trail. He said he would back a constitutional amendment to impose term limits on members of Congress. And then he also talked about planting our beautiful American flag on the surface of Mars. And so I guess that's what I mean was a little bit of a Trumpian grab bag to me. The speech was kind of all over the place. And I guess that's what you get, Monet, when you get an hour plus of Donald Trump in front of a microphone.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I would agree with Kim in that the more surprising thing about his announcement being how sort of on message he was in terms of articulating basically the core successes of his term as president and basically suggesting that he would double down on those things if he were returned to office. And so you heard a lot about him contrasting the economic expansion during his presidency and growing wages with the negative real wages that we've seen during inflation under the Biden presidency. You heard a lot about him avoiding foreign entanglements and basically taking credit for a strong foreign policy of countering China, Iran, and ISIS, but also not getting the United States involved in any kind of long-term war. And so anyone who is still warm to Trump would have been reminded about why they liked him and some of the real achievements that he had as president. But I think that you both are completely correct in suggesting everyone knows that from time to time Trump might stick to a script, but that really the focus of his candidacy is going to be relitigating the 2020 election, and that will make him completely unpalatable to moderate voters, even if they do agree with a lot of what he promises to do if he were returned to office. And so we know that the race is shaping up essentially to be a decision among sort of the Republican Party base about how willing they are to relitigate that 2020 election story again.
Kim, what do you make of the timing of this announcement 1 week exactly after the 2022 midterm elections on November 8th? And I got a kick out of the New York Post's little write-up, and the headline on the bottom of the front cover is "Florida Man Makes Announcement." Page 26, and then on page 26 it begins, "With just 720 days to go before the next election, a Florida retiree made the surprise announcement Tuesday night that he was running for president." And boy, 720 days. I do wonder whether a lot of people who just voted and maybe they follow politics casually are a little mystified by what is going on here.
Yeah, when Donald Trump himself in the speech says, 2 years is a long time. And I was just looking at him going, no kidding, dude. This is unprecedented. Nobody has ever got in this early. You can see the reasons that Donald Trump is doing it. They're pretty obvious. One, he is hoping to clear the field and try to forestall anybody else from getting in, whether it be Ron DeSantis or Mike Pompeo. Interestingly, most of those people, or at least some of those people, have come out and said that they will not be deterred by Donald Trump and that they're going to stay to their own timeline, which will probably be next spring when they make a decision as to whether they get in. So this is amazing, and that Donald Trump is basically going to be running all by himself on both sides of the aisle for the next 6 or 7 months, while the rest of us just sit around and watch the show. He did it as well to try to ward off a Department of Justice indictment. I don't know if that will matter in the end, but he is trying to basically say, look, this would be way too politicized for you to indict a candidate that's actually out there and running. The timing aspect about this, though, which I think is really important and is already making people feel a little sour all over again about Trump, is that, we come out of this midterm, Republicans didn't do very great, a lot of it because of candidates that were tied to Trump and his involvement. And now here is this very important moment coming up in just a few weeks, which is the Georgia Senate runoff. And even though Republicans cannot win the Senate, the difference between having a 50-50 balance there and a 51-49 balance there is really huge in terms of what Republicans might be able to stop in terms of the Biden agenda. And it just seems inappropriate to a lot of folks I've been talking to that Trump has barged in here now. It could potentially weigh on Herschel Walker. He's too tied against Trump. Does this now race in some ways now become a little bit connected to Trump as a candidate already as president? And does that hurt the Republican in the Georgia Senate race?
That's why, though, it seems to me that the argument you made about the Justice Department and the potential for an indictment coming down maybe explains a lot of what's going on here, because we know that there were Trump advisors after the Georgia Senate race went to a runoff on December 6th who advised him that it would be better to wait on this announcement until after that runoff. And for whatever reason, he has chosen not to do that. And like I said, I do think that President Trump wants to be an announced Republican candidate opposing Joe Biden politically if there is going to be any sort of indictment that comes down against him. And the Justice Department, at least, has some guidelines that they tend not to do any sort of indictments of that nature in the lead up to an election. I don't know if that official rule would apply to a former office holder, but certainly in the lead up to November 8th, you can understand why the Justice Department would still sort of want to take a hands-off approach. And so maybe the answer to the question, Monet, is that he didn't want to wait until after December 6th because it seemed like it was risky to put off the announcement that long. That would give the Justice Department a window, perhaps.
Right. I think it's entirely possible to think that the possibility of avoiding an indictment was something that encouraged Trump to confirm his decision to run and also to speed up the timeline for doing it. And that makes sense if you hear the stories of people close to him saying that he's wanted to announce for a long time, thought about doing it over the summer, thought about even doing it in Ohio the day of or the day before the midterm elections. Basically, his preference has always been to do it as soon as possible. And announcing, even at this phase, is still much earlier than candidates usually announce. And so it stands to reason that he had a strong preference for going as early as possible because he knows an indictment could be coming, doesn't know exactly when that would be, and knows that if he is a declared presidential candidate, that does diminish the chances that the Justice Department would move ahead with an indictment by quite a lot. And I do think that from a purely tactical perspective, he's probably right about that. I do think that it already was kind of marginal case of whether the Justice Department would bring charges based on his improper holding of some of these documents. I think a lot of people think, well, yes, this clearly is against the letter of the law in some ways, but is this really something that we need to charge a former president with? Was the raid on his home in Florida justified because of basically a procedural crime like mishandling of certain documents? Now that he's a declared presidential candidate, that shifts the balance even further. So it's still possible that they'll bring charges. It's possible that they'll appoint a special counsel, but I think that they know that they have to weigh that against what's going to look like a political witch hunt if they do decide to bring those charges.